Tonight, we're going back to the winter of 1887, to a frozen frontier where one man's loneliness, one woman's courage, and one little girl's Christmas wish would change 3 lives forever. Settle in. This one will stay with you. The snow had been falling since morning. By the time the last gray light faded behind the mountains, the hills of Cotter's Ridge were buried under 2 feet of white silence, and the wind had taken on that particular cruelty it reserved for the deep heart of winter, the kind that didn't just chill the skin, but reached into a man's bones and reminded him of everything he had lost. Inside the small log cabin at the edge of the Mercer property, a single oil lamp burned on the table. Its light was honest and modest, the way everything in that home had become since the fever took Clara 18 months ago. Eli Mercer stood at the frost-edged window, one broad hand resting against the wooden frame, watching the snow come down in the darkness. He was 34 years old, though the years of ranching, grief, and sleepless nights had added a heaviness to his face that made him appear older. His shoulders, wide as any working man's, carried more than muscle. They carried the invisible, crushing weight of a father who was trying his best and quietly terrified it would never be enough. Behind him, from the small room off the kitchen, he could hear his daughter Sophie's voice, soft and murmuring. She was 6 years old, and she was telling her cloth doll about Christmas, about how maybe, this year, things would be different, about how she had asked God very politely for a mama. Eli closed his eyes. He had heard her say it before, in her prayers at bedtime, in the questions she asked Mrs. Holt at the general store, in the silence between them at supper when she would glance at Clara's empty chair and then look down at her plate without a word. She never cried in front of him. She was, in that heartbreaking way of small children who have sensed their parents' pain, trying to protect him. That was the moment, 3 months ago, that Eli had finally sat down and written the letter. He had never planned to marry again. Love like what he'd had with Clara didn't come twice. He was certain of that. But Sophie needed more than a rancher father who smelled of horses and was better at mending fences than mending hearts. She needed a woman's steadiness, a woman's warmth, someone who could teach her to braid her hair and tell her the things a girl needed to know about becoming a person in this world. So he had responded to an advertisement in the Denver Courier. Miss Margaret Elaine Holt, formerly of St. Louis, seeking placement as a homestead companion and wife. References available. Industrious, God-fearing, of good character. He had not written back expecting love. He had written back expecting competence, a practical arrangement, the way frontier life demanded of people. He had sent the train fare. He had written the date, Christmas Eve, arriving Cotter's Ridge Station, 4 o'clock. He had not expected a storm, and he had not expected what walked off that train. The station at Cotter's Ridge was nothing more than a covered platform and a coal stove that the station master, old Amos Purcell, kept fed with reluctant efficiency. By the time Eli tied his horse at the post and stepped under the overhang, stamping snow from his boots, the 4 o'clock train had already been delayed 40 minutes. 3 other men stood waiting, hats pulled low, collars up. None of them spoke. The cold had a way of making silence feel appropriate. When the train finally came, groaning and steaming through the white curtain of the storm, Eli straightened and watched the passenger car door open. 2 men in thick coats stepped off first, then a family, a mother pulling a child by the hand, bundled like a small woolen barrel, then a pause, and then she stepped down. She was not what he had imagined. The woman who descended from that train onto the platform of Cotter's Ridge Station wore a coat that had seen far better decades. It was brown and thin, and the hem was frayed at the bottom in a way that no amount of careful mending had been able to fully disguise.
Her boots were worn to a near-perfect smoothness at the sole. She carried one small bag, not a proper traveling trunk, not even a modest valise, but a single cloth bag that a woman might use to carry groceries, clutched in both hands in front of her. She was perhaps 28. Her hair, dark and pinned back neatly despite the wind's best efforts to undo it, framed a face that was pale from cold, but composed with a quietness that Eli could not quite name. Not proud, not afraid, something more uncommon than either. Dignified. Her eyes found him immediately, perhaps because he was the only man standing alone, or perhaps because she had been preparing for this moment the entire ride from Denver and had simply decided she would not look away from it. "Mr. Mercer," she said. It was not a question. "Yes, ma'am." He took his hat off. He was not entirely sure why. It was a reflex born from something deeper than manners. "Miss Margaret." "Margaret Elaine Holt." She extended one hand. It was bare, no gloves. Her fingers were reddened from the cold. "I apologize for the delay. The weather, I'm afraid."
Eli shook her hand. It was firm, steady. He noticed she did not apologize for her coat or her single bag or anything else that another woman in her position might have felt the need to explain away. She simply stood in the snow on Christmas Eve in worn-out boots and looked at him as though she had arrived exactly as she intended. He was aware, in his peripheral vision, of old Amos Purcell watching from behind the station window. He was aware of the other men on the platform glancing sideways. He knew what Cotter's Ridge would make of this. He knew what would be said at the general store and at the church and over supper tables across town. He picked up her bag before she could protest. It weighed almost nothing, and he nodded toward the wagon. "It's a cold ride," he said. "About 4 miles. I've got a blanket." "I've been cold before," Margaret said simply, and followed him into the snow. Sophie was still awake when they arrived. She had promised her father she would sleep, but the oil lamp was burning, and her small face appeared immediately in the gap of her bedroom door when she heard boots on the porch. 2 sets instead of 1. Eli set down the bag inside the door and turned to find his daughter standing in her nightgown, dark eyes wide and fixed on the woman who had just stepped into their home. Margaret stopped. For just a moment, the composure she had carried since stepping off that train shifted, not into nervousness, but into something softer. She looked at Sophie the way a person looks at something unexpected and beautiful, the way you might look at a single wildflower growing up through a crack in winter stone. She knelt down, right there at the door, still in her threadbare coat, still cold from the ride. "You must be Sophie," she said gently. "Your father told me about you in his letter. He said you were the best part of the whole ranch." Sophie looked at her father. Eli hadn't written that, or at least he hadn't known he had, but looking at his daughter's face, he was grateful that Margaret had said it. Sophie stepped forward, just 1 step. "Are you going to be my mama?" The room held its breath. Margaret did not flinch, and she did not offer the easy, hollow reassurance that would have been simpler. She looked at the little girl steadily and said, "I'm going to try very hard to be your friend first. Would that be all right?" Sophie considered this with the gravity that 6-year-olds reserve for truly important decisions. Then she nodded. "You can sleep near the stove," she said. "It's the warmest spot." Eli turned away toward the fire so that neither of them would see his face. By the day after Christmas, Cotter's Ridge had already formed its opinion. Mrs. Norbert at the dry goods store mentioned to 3 separate customers that the Mercer bride had arrived with nothing but a rag bag. The Reverend Calhoun's wife, a woman of extraordinary efficiency when it came to the distribution of judgment, remarked at a quilting circle that it was a shame what some men were reduced to, placing advertisements like they were selling cattle. Holt Davies, who fancied himself the social arbiter of the Ridge, said plainly to Eli's face at the feed store that a man of Eli's standing, modest as it was, could have done considerably better. Eli said nothing.
He said nothing because he was still figuring out what he thought himself. Margaret had not complained once in the 4 days since her arrival. She had risen before him every morning and had the stove fed and the coffee ready before he finished pulling on his boots. She had found Clara's old recipe book on the shelf and, without being asked and without any ceremony, had quietly begun using it. Not to replace Clara, it seemed, but to honor the home that had been built before her. She had mended the tear in Sophie's winter coat with stitches so small and even they looked like they had come from a sewing machine. She had read to Sophie every night, doing gentle voices for the characters in the stories, until Sophie fell asleep with a smile still curved at the corner of her mouth. She never spoke of her past. Not yet. Eli had wondered, in the dark hours before sleep, what circumstances had reduced a woman of obvious intelligence and quiet grace to arriving in a frontier town on Christmas Eve with one bag and a worn-out coat. He told himself it was none of his business. He told himself the arrangement was practical and the particulars of her history didn't matter. But he was beginning to suspect, in a place deeper than logic, that her history mattered very much, and that it had made her into exactly the kind of person his daughter needed. It was on a Tuesday, 12 days after Christmas, that the true test came. Eli had ridden to town for supplies. The sky had been pale and still when he left, but by mid-morning a second storm had rolled down from the northern mountains, one of those sudden, vicious winter blows that old-timers said could kill a man in 20 minutes if he wasn't sheltered. Margaret was alone with Sophie. She had seen the sky change. She had read the color of it, that particular greenish-gray that meant something serious, and she had acted before she had time to be afraid. She brought in extra wood, she latched every shutter, she filled the water barrel. She took Sophie's hand, and she sat her down by the stove, and she said in a voice so calm it could have been describing the weather in summer, "We're going to stay right here together until your papa comes home. Can you help me keep the fire fed?" Sophie had nodded, serious and steady, the way she always was when the adults around her needed her to be. The storm hit like a wall. The windows went white. The wind found every crack in the cabin logs and whistled through them like something alive. For 3 hours, Margaret kept the fire burning, kept Sophie occupied with a game of counting the gusts, kept the fear out of her own voice with a concentration that was, in its quiet way, heroic. When Eli finally fought his way through the drifts to the cabin door, half frozen, his coat caked in ice, he opened it to find his daughter asleep on the floor by the stove, wrapped in every blanket in the house, and Margaret sitting beside her in the last of the lamplight, one hand resting gently on the child's back. She had been reading aloud, though Sophie was long past hearing it. She looked up when he came in, and her face in that light was, he would think about this moment for a long time afterward, simply, quietly relieved, not for herself, for him, that he had made it home. "She's fine," Margaret said softly. "She was wonderful. She never cried once." Eli stood in the doorway for a moment too long. Snow dripped from his hat onto the floor. He felt something in his chest, something that had been locked and still for a very long time, shift. "Sit down," Margaret said gently. "I'll get the coffee." It was the following Sunday that she told him. They were sitting at the table after Sophie went to bed, the wind outside reduced to a low sigh, the fire burning low and steady. He had not asked, but she had decided, in that way she had of deciding things quietly and fully, that he deserved to know. She had been a school teacher in St. Louis. Her husband, a merchant, had died of heart failure 3 years prior, leaving debts that consumed everything, the house, the savings, the modest life she had built. Her family, what remained of it, had not been in a position to help. She had taught until the school district consolidated and her position was eliminated. She had mended clothes, taken in laundry, stretched every dollar until it wore thin. And then she had seen the advertisement in the Denver Courier, and she had understood, with the clear-eyed practicality that difficulty teaches, that dignity was not about what you wore or what you carried. It was about what you did with what you had.
"I didn't deceive you," she said, looking at him directly across the table. "I told you in my letters I was industrious and of good character. I am both of those things. I couldn't tell you about the rest until I knew whether you were the kind of man who would hear it fairly." Eli looked at his hands on the table for a long moment. "And am I?" he asked quietly. Margaret considered him the way she considered everything, with a patience that was never passive, always searching. "I think so," she said. "Yes." Outside, the wind was still. The fire made its small, steady sounds. Somewhere in the back room, Sophie was dreaming, and if the slight curve at the corner of her sleeping mouth meant anything at all, she was dreaming well. Eli looked up. "I wrote to you out of duty," he said, slowly, as though working it out as he spoke. "I want you to know that changed. Somewhere between the station and that storm and tonight, it changed." Margaret said nothing, but she did not look away. They were married in the spring, in a small ceremony at the Cotter's Ridge Church, with Sophie standing between them, holding both of their hands. Mrs. Norbert sent a pie. Holt Davies offered a handshake that was at least 3 months overdue. The Reverend Calhoun said what he always said about the grace of new beginnings, and this time, Eli thought, he actually meant it. But the moment Eli remembered longest, the one he would carry the rest of his life like a warm coal in the chest, was not the wedding. It was Christmas Eve, the following December. He came in from the barn to find the cabin lit by more candles than he had ever seen burning in it at once. Margaret had strung dried berries along the mantel and cut paper stars that Sophie had colored in every shade she could reach. The smell of pine and something baking and wood smoke filled every corner of the room. Sophie was standing on a chair, reaching up to hang the last paper star from a nail above the window. Margaret stood behind her, both hands steady on the girl's waist so she wouldn't fall. They were laughing about something, some small private joke between them, and neither of them heard him come in. He stood in the doorway for a moment, hat in hand, the cold at his back and the warmth ahead of him, watching the two of them in the candlelight. He thought of Clara. He let himself. He thought of her gently, the way you think of the first chapter of a story that led you, through paths you never would have chosen, to the chapter. Then Sophie turned and saw him. "Papa, come see what we made!" He walked inside. He set his hat on the hook. He crossed the room to where his daughter stood on her chair, and he wrapped one arm around her. And then, quietly, without ceremony, the way all the truest things happened in that cabin, he reached out and took Margaret's hand. She looked at him. He said nothing. He didn't need to. Outside, the snow was falling on Cotter's Ridge, soft and steady and deep. Inside, the fire was burning, and in a small log cabin on the edge of the frontier, a family, stitched together from loss and courage and the unexpected grace of second chances, sat down together to celebrate Christmas. Sometimes the greatest worth is hidden beneath the surface of things. A worn coat does not tell you what is sewn into the heart beneath it. A bare bag does not measure the richness of what a person carries inside. And a home that has known grief is not a home beyond hope. It is simply a home waiting for the right kind of courage to walk through its door. Eli Mercer learned that duty and love are not enemies. They are, sometimes, the same road, walked long enough, honestly enough, and humbly enough, until you lift your eyes and find yourself somewhere you never expected to be.
If this story touched your heart the way the best stories do, slowly, quietly, and in the places you didn't know were open, then this channel was made for you. At Desert Hearth, we believe that the stories worth telling are the ones worth keeping. Stories of ordinary people who chose courage over comfort, love over pride, and kindness over judgment. If you're new here, welcome home. Hit that subscribe button and ring the bell so you never miss a story. And if you've been here a while, thank you, truly. Your time and your heart mean everything to this channel. Leave a comment below and tell us what part of this story stayed with you. We'll see you next time, here at Desert Hearth, where every ember has a story and every story has a light.